The nurse whispered, "She doesn't have anyone left." He looked at the trembling little girl in the hospital bed, and without thinking, the words left his lips. "She's my daughter now." But before we dive into this journey, leave me a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Michael Hale sat hunched in the plastic chair of the pediatric waiting room, his mop leaning against his shoulder like a tired soldier standing guard. The clock above the reception desk ticked too loudly, the kind of sound that made every second drag like an hour. His daughter Emily was behind closed doors somewhere down the hall, a doctor running tests for the asthma attacks that had been stealing her sleep, stealing his peace, stealing the small breaths of childhood she deserved. 10 years old, and already her lungs fought like an old woman's. Michael rubbed his hands together, calloused palms rough against each other, and tried not to imagine inhalers that stopped working, nights that ended in ambulance sirens. The vending machine coffee at his side had gone cold. He hadn't touched it. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon-scented cleaner, a scent he knew well, because sometimes he was the one pushing the bucket through these halls, mopping up after the lives that unraveled here. Tonight, though, he wasn't staff. He was just a father, bone-tired, heart-anxious, sitting in a chair too small for the weight he carried. That was when he heard it. A sound so thin, so fragile, it almost blended with the hum of the fluorescent lights. Not the sharp cry of a child in pain, not the tantrum of a little one denied a toy. No, this was something else, a sound that had forgotten what comfort was supposed to feel like, a soft cry, hollow, stripped of hope. Michael's head lifted. His eyes drifted down the corridor, past the authorized personnel-only sign, past the places where his badge wouldn't give him clearance tonight. He should have stayed seated. He should have waited for Emily's doctor to come back with results. But rules had never been louder than instinct, and his instinct was already pulling him to his feet. He left the coffee, left the waiting chair, and followed the sound. His boots squeaked against the polished linoleum as he moved down the hall, past half-open doors where machines beeped, where nurses murmured in low voices, where parents bent over their children with worry carved into their faces. And then he saw her. A small girl, 6, maybe 7 years old, lay curled in the wide hospital bed like a sparrow caught in a storm. The sheets swallowed her small frame, her blonde hair stuck to her damp forehead, her tiny hands wrapped tightly around a teddy bear whose fur had long since faded from too much love. The bear's ear was frayed, one button eye missing, but she held it like it was the only anchor left in her world. Michael froze in the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but unable to leave. She looked at him then, eyes wide, eyes dark, eyes holding the kind of storms children shouldn't have to weather. There was no accusation in them, no demand, only the raw ache of someone who had been waiting too long for someone to come back. A nurse passed by and caught his stare. She slowed, then sighed softly, the kind of sigh that carried too much history. "Her mother left an hour ago," she said under her breath, like she didn't want the words to exist. Signed nothing, just left. Michael's throat tightened. He looked back at the girl, alone, sick, abandoned. He thought of Emily, 10 years old, waiting for her test results, and how her little fingers still curled around his sleeve when she was scared. He thought of the night Emily's mother, his wife, had slipped away on a hospital bed not unlike this one, leaving him to stumble through grief with a baby in his arms. He remembered the hollow cry Emily made in her crib when no one but him answered. This wasn't supposed to be his problem. He had enough problems. Rent overdue, bills stacked on the kitchen counter, hours cut back at the hospital cleaning staff. He was barely keeping his own daughter afloat. And yet, as the little girl's trembling hand stroked the ragged ear of her teddy bear, Michael felt something stir deep inside him. Not pity, not charity, something older, fiercer. The instinct of a father who had already lost too much, who knew the cost of absence, the urge to protect. He stepped further into the room, quietly, carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. She didn't turn away. She just looked at him, eyes wide and desperate, like she was daring the world to give her one reason to keep believing in it. Michael's chest ached. He wasn't her father, but in that moment, standing in the half-light of the hospital room, he wanted to be. Her name was Ava, 6 years old, though if you looked into her eyes you might have guessed older, much older. They carried something too heavy for a child, the shadowed weight of someone who already knew what it meant to be left behind. Fragile as glass, her skin pale against the bleached hospital sheets, she clutched a teddy bear so tightly it seemed ready to split. One button eye was missing, the other hanging by a thread, but she held it like it was a lifeline, the last thread tethering her to a world that kept walking away. The nurse leaned close to Michael, as if ashamed of the words she was about to say. Her mother stormed out an hour ago. Big fight over the phone. Investors, maybe, I don't know. She said— The nurse hesitated, her lips tightening. She said she couldn't do it anymore. The words hung in the air like a curse. Couldn't do it anymore. As if love were a job you clocked out of. As if parenthood had an exit door you could walk through when the meetings got too long and the pressure got too loud. Michael felt the sting in his chest. He had heard excuses like that before. Different words, but the same hollow echo. People leaving when it got too hard. He studied the little girl again. Ava's breaths came shallow, her small chest rising and falling beneath the folds of a blanket far too big for her. The pneumonia had weakened her, the nurse explained, but it wasn't just her lungs that seemed fragile. It was her spirit, her way of folding in on herself, like someone who had already learned not to expect anyone to stay. Michael thought of Emily, his own daughter, how she once clung to him after her mother's funeral, her tiny fists knotted in his shirt, terrified that if she let go, he might vanish too. Children shouldn't have to beg for stability. They shouldn't have to fight for the right to be seen, to be wanted. Ava coughed, a thin, rattling sound that tore at him more than he expected. Her lips parted, voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the beeping monitor beside her bed. "Is she coming back?" she asked. The question was too large for such a small body. Her eyes didn't blink when she asked it. She already knew the answer. But still, she asked, because children always ask. They always hope. The nurse said nothing. She turned away, busying herself with adjusting an IV line, her silence louder than words could ever be. Michael felt the hollowness of it press into the room, the way silence can feel like rejection. He couldn't let it stand. He pulled the chair closer, slow, so as not to frighten her. His boots scraped softly against the tile. He sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady on hers. She watched him with the suspicion of someone used to disappointment. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "I'm here now," he said. 3 words, spoken not like a promise to be weighed, but like a fact that already existed. His voice carried the rough edges of a man who'd lived through too many storms, but beneath it was the steady tone of someone who meant every syllable. Ava's grip on the teddy loosened just slightly, her shoulders lowering by an inch. It was almost imperceptible, but Michael saw it. Trust trying to grow roots in soil that had been scorched. He stayed. Minutes bled into an hour, the sterile hum of the hospital filling the spaces where words weren't needed. Sometimes he spoke softly, asking if she wanted water or if she liked to draw. Mostly, he just sat, a silent guard against the emptiness that had crept into her world. In another room down the hall, Emily was being monitored, doctors checking her breathing, nurses logging charts. Michael should have been there, waiting for answers about his own child. But he didn't move. Something had anchored him to Ava's bedside, a quiet knowing that this moment mattered, maybe more than he could understand. Ava's eyes drifted closed eventually, lashes trembling against pale cheeks. The teddy bear slipped slightly from her grasp, but didn't fall. She breathed shallowly, but she slept. Michael leaned back in the chair, exhaustion tugging at his bones, and let the weight of what had just happened settle. He had walked into that room a stranger. He sat there now as something else. Not her father, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, the beginning of one. Michael's mind slipped back into a place he hated returning to, yet one that never left him for long. The corridor had been just as white, just as sterile, humming with the same machines that kept count of breaths and heartbeats. He remembered the way the tile gleamed under the harsh light, as if even grief should be polished to look respectable. Emily had been only 2, strapped into a stroller too big for her tiny body, her cries bouncing off the walls, sharp, panicked, searching for someone who would never come back. His wife's breath had grown shorter and shallower until it wasn't there at all, and the sound of Emily's sobs had filled the silence. That was the night Michael learned what abandonment looked like. Not the kind where someone chooses to leave, but the kind where someone is ripped away and there is nothing you can do but stand there, helpless, holding the pieces. He looked at Ava now, fragile and small in the bed, clutching her battered teddy as if it were the last friend she had. Her lips trembled even in sleep, her little chest rising and falling with effort. It pressed against him like salt, ground into an open wound, a reminder of how quickly a child learns the weight of loss. The hollow sound she'd made earlier, asking if her mother was coming back, wasn't just her voice. It was Emily's voice all over again. It was every child left behind, waiting in vain for footsteps that never returned. He hadn't planned on this. God, he couldn't afford to plan on this. His life was already held together with duct tape and overtime shifts, rent late more often than not, groceries stretched thinner each month. Emily's inhalers stacked like fragile hope in a kitchen cupboard, each one a reminder that the smallest things could turn into emergencies. Some nights he sat at the table with the bills spread out like battlefield maps, staring until the numbers blurred. He was barely holding on with one child. The idea of another was madness. And yet here he was, sitting in a chair pulled up to the bedside of a girl who wasn't his, watching her tremble through fever dreams. He couldn't explain it to himself, not in a way that would hold up in the cold light of morning. But some decisions, the ones that change the course of a life, aren't made in the head. They're made in the heart first, reckless and raw, long before reason has a chance to argue. The nurse came in to check vitals, adjusting a line, scribbling notes on her chart. Michael leaned closer to her, his voice low so as not to wake Ava. "Don't let her wake up alone," he whispered. His throat was tight, but his words were steady. The nurse looked at him, eyes softening, and nodded once. It was a small thing, a simple promise, but to Michael it meant everything. He leaned back in the chair, exhaustion tugging at him like a tide pulling out to sea. His muscles ached from long shifts, his eyelids heavy from nights that never seemed to end. But as he sat there, staring at Ava's small figure curled beneath the blanket, something struck him with sudden force. He hadn't just asked for her comfort tonight. He hadn't just spoken for this one fevered evening in a hospital bed. No, the words had come from deeper, from a place carved out the night Emily's cries echoed in a corridor and no one else came running, from the part of him that had sworn silently that his daughter would never feel abandoned. And now, somehow, that vow had grown bigger. It reached out past Emily and settled on this child, too. He realized, with a jolt that left him sitting straighter in the chair, that he had just promised himself something vast, something irreversible. That no child within his reach, no matter how broken, no matter how forgotten, would ever have to wake up to an empty room again. The following morning carried a different kind of weight in the hospital wing. The hush of overnight care, the low voices of nurses, the shuffle of carts. The occasional cough echoing down sterile corridors was broken by the sharp staccato of heels striking tile. It was the sound of authority, a rhythm too deliberate to belong anywhere near children's wards. A faint trail of perfume, rich and expensive, drifted ahead of her like a warning. Heads turned, nurses straightened. Even the doctor lingering by the nurses' station adjusted his tie, as though her presence demanded the whole building pull itself together. Rebecca Ward arrived the way storms arrive, sudden, cutting, and impossible to ignore. 38 years old, CEO of a company whose name was printed across skyscrapers, she wore her sunglasses indoors as though they were armor. Her posture was flawless, but the edges of her composure betrayed sleeplessness. Eyes shadowed, lips pressed into a line too thin to hold. She scanned the room like she was assessing assets instead of lives. When her gaze landed on the small figure in the bed, it wasn't maternal softness that appeared. It was calculation, quick and cold, the look of someone measuring the weight of responsibility against the inconvenience of carrying it. "How is she?" Rebecca's voice was flat. All business. No rise of emotion, no catch at the word she. The nurse, professional but uneasy, gave the update clinically. Fever lowering, lungs still tight, pneumonia still critical, but stabilizing. Rebecca nodded once, curtly, as if approving a quarterly report. Her phone was already in her hand before the nurse had finished speaking, thumb flicking across the screen with the urgency of someone whose real life existed in numbers and emails, not in the fragile breaths of a 6-year-old girl. Michael stood nearby, mop in hand, pretending to clean a stretch of already gleaming floor. His jaw clenched as he watched. This was her daughter, her flesh and blood, sick and scared, lying in a bed far too big for her tiny frame. And yet Rebecca's presence felt more like a performance for the staff than a homecoming for her child. Michael's grip tightened on the mop handle until his knuckles whitened. He thought of Emily, thought of the nights he had slept upright in hospital chairs just to make sure she never woke up alone. To see a mother stand feet away and act as though her daughter were another bullet point to be managed, it lit something sharp in him, something that burned low and dangerous. Rebecca finally set the phone aside just long enough to step to the edge of the bed. She leaned down, lips close to Ava's ear, whispering something only her daughter could hear. But Ava turned her face away, burying her cheek against the worn fur of her teddy bear. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at her mother. The rejection was quiet, but it echoed louder than any shouted protest. Rebecca straightened quickly, mask back in place, but her fingers twitched as she slipped her sunglasses higher on the bridge of her nose. That small moment told the whole story. No press release, no polished statement. No carefully worded public apology could erase the image of a child turning away from her own mother. Michael saw it clearly, sharper than anything else in that room. This wasn't a mistake born of exhaustion or ignorance or lack of resources. This was something colder. It was absence dressed up in power suits. It was abandonment hidden behind designer perfume and tinted lenses. Rebecca murmured a few final instructions to the staff, her voice clipped, efficient. Then she pivoted, heels striking the floor once again, and strode out as quickly as she had entered, already mid-call before the automatic doors slid shut behind her. The space she left behind felt heavier, not lighter. Michael exhaled slowly, his grip loosening on the mop handle. He glanced at Ava. She hadn't moved. She still clutched her teddy, face turned firmly away from the door her mother had disappeared through. And in that fragile silence, Michael understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever came next, this little girl needed more than duty. She needed someone who would stay. It happened quickly, in the sort of way life-changing moments often do, without warning, without ceremony, without giving anyone time to think through the consequences. Rebecca's phone had buzzed, some sharp vibration that seemed to matter more than the child in the bed, and she had stepped outside mid-sentence. Her heels clicked down the hall until the sound faded and the room was left to silence. The absence was immediate, suffocating, like the air had been vacuumed out the moment she crossed the threshold. Ava stirred against the oversized hospital pillow, lashes fluttering, her small hand still gripping the teddy bear by its frayed ear. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the blinds. The first thing she did was glance at the doorway. Empty. She blinked once, then twice, as though maybe if she kept looking, the figure she wanted would materialize there. When it didn't, her chest rose and fell too quickly, her breaths catching like hiccups, and a wet shine gathered at the corners of her eyes. "She's not coming back, is she?" Ava whispered. It wasn't asked like a question so much as a confession, words spoken into the void because keeping them inside hurt worse. Michael had been standing just outside, mop set against the wall, waiting, half guard, half shadow. The sound of her voice broke him open in ways he hadn't expected. Something in its smallness, its trembling honesty, struck the scar tissue inside him that never really healed. He stepped in before he thought better of it, crossing the line between witness and participant. He knelt beside the bed, knees pressing into the cold tile. For a moment his hand hovered over hers, uncertain. What right did he have? What claim could he possibly make? But hesitation gave way to instinct, and he let his calloused fingers settle gently over her tiny hand. The contrast was stark, his rough, weathered palm covering her small, fragile one. And then the words came, not planned, not measured, not approved by reason or practicality. They slipped out of him like something that had been waiting at the back of his throat for years. "She's my daughter now." The moment they left his mouth, the weight of them hit him square in the chest. His own breath caught. He wasn't sure if he had meant to say it aloud or if the truth had simply forced its way into sound. It startled him, like hearing a stranger speak through his own lips. Logic screamed that he couldn't afford this, couldn't carry one more responsibility, couldn't promise what the world would demand he prove. But the heart is rarely quiet once it decides something. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't question. She didn't even hesitate. She clutched his hand with a suddenness that nearly made him lose his composure, her tiny fingers gripping with the desperation of someone who had been waiting all her short life to hear those exact words. She buried her face against the teddy bear, but her grip on him stayed firm, unyielding, as though letting go might cause the words to vanish like smoke. Outside the glass pane, a nurse walking by froze. She had heard it, her eyes going wide, mouth parting in quiet shock. She didn't move, didn't interrupt, because something sacred had taken root in that room. Michael felt it too. In the stillness that followed, the world shifted. His life, already worn thin by responsibility, already stretched to breaking, had just taken on something heavier and infinitely more precious. He hadn't just spoken comfort into a lonely night. He had crossed an invisible line. There would be no going back, not for him, not for her. Ava's breathing steadied, the tears drying against her cheeks. Her hand, still holding onto his, relaxed slightly, not in release, but in trust. And in that trust, Michael understood the full truth of what he had just said. Nothing in his world or hers would ever be the same again. Reality arrived with the morning shift, as it always did in hospitals. Night softened things, made promises feel weighty and true, but daylight dragged everything back into order. Clipboards, charts, signatures, protocols. Hospitals didn't run on compassion, they ran on paperwork. The woman who entered Ava's room carried the weight of bureaucracy in her hands. A social worker, her blazer rumpled, hair pinned back hastily, eyes ringed by exhaustion. She looked like someone who had seen too many families fracture under her watch and had learned not to get too close. The clipboard in her grip was her shield. "You can't just claim her," she said, voice blunt, clipped, the kind that didn't invite argument. Michael straightened from the chair beside Ava's bed, his spine stiff from sleeping upright, his mind still thick with the memory of what he'd whispered the night before, the words that had changed everything. He looked at the social worker, jaw set. "I'm not claiming her. I'm here for her." The woman's pen tapped against the paper as if punctuation could hold back the tide of human need. "That's not how it works," she replied. "She has a legal guardian. Until that changes, decisions aren't yours to make." Emily sat cross-legged on the bed, her small hands weaving strands of Ava's hair into a clumsy braid. She whispered something that made Ava giggle softly, the sound fragile but real, like glass chimes in the wind. Ava leaned into her body language clear. Here was safety. Here was sisterhood. The social worker paused at the sight. For just a moment, her pen stopped moving, her eyes flicked up, and something flickered. Hesitation, maybe even longing. But rules were rules, and she was bound by them. Her mother hasn't relinquished her rights, she continued, voice tightening as though she needed to convince herself as much as him. Until she does, Ava will be placed in temporary foster care while we review the case. The words landed like a gavel. Foster care. Another stranger's house. Another bedroom filled with someone else's things. Another goodbye. Michael felt his chest burn, a pressure building against his ribs like something was clawing its way out. He thought of Emily at 2 years old, clinging to him after the funeral, how she had needed him to prove with every breath that he wouldn't disappear. He thought of Ava's whisper the night before. "She's not coming back, is she?" And how she had gripped his hand when he told her the only thing he could. He stepped closer to the social worker, not menacing, but immovable. His voice steady steel. "Over my dead body," he said. Her brows rose, but she didn't flinch. She'd heard threats before, anger before. But this was different. His words weren't bluster. They were anchored in something unshakable. A man who had already buried one love and refused to let another child be buried in loneliness. Emily looked up at him, braid half finished, eyes wide with a kind of awe she hadn't shown him in years. In that moment she saw her father not as the tired man scrubbing floors to pay rent, not as the dad who sometimes fell asleep at the kitchen table, but as someone willing to plant himself like a tree in front of a storm. The social worker shifted her weight, pen scratching against the clipboard again, her armor returning. "I'll make a note," she said quietly, though her tone carried the faintest trace of something softer. She turned toward the door, papers rustling like chains. Michael stayed where he was, hands clenched at his sides, breath tight but steady. For the first time since his wife died, survival wasn't enough. He wasn't just fighting for his own blood anymore, he was fighting for the right of a child to belong, and he knew, deep in his bones, that no form, no signature, no law of convenience was going to stand in his way. Rebecca returned as the sun slipped beneath the city skyline, the hospital corridors awash in the amber spill of evening light. The perfume she wore no longer masked the fatigue in her step, and though her posture was still impeccable, her sunglasses had vanished, revealing shadows carved deep beneath her eyes. The boardroom mask was cracked at the edges, but she carried herself as though she could still command the air to obey. Nurses glanced her way, then quickly busied themselves with charts as if proximity to her sharpness might cut too deep. Michael had been waiting. He leaned against the cool wall of the corridor, arms crossed, mop bucket pushed to the side like a forgotten prop. He'd seen her come and go before, quick visits filled with distracted glances and clipped instructions. But tonight there was no escaping. When she reached for the door to her daughter's room, his voice broke through, low and steady. "Why did you leave her?" She froze, fingers hovering over the handle. Slowly she turned, eyes narrowing, but there was no fire, only a thin, trembling restraint. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable. She looked cornered. "You think I wanted this?" she hissed. Her words sharp but cracked, brittle glass, trying to pass for steel. Her voice dropped, rawer now, her composure thinning with every syllable. "Do you know what it's like to build empires while raising a child who doesn't want you?" Michael pushed off the wall, stepping closer, his eyes steady on hers. He didn't flinch, didn't soften. Rebecca's throat tightened as she went on. "Every time she looks at me, she sees what I'm not, what I couldn't be. Do you have any idea what it's like to give everything, and still not be enough?" Her chest rose and fell quickly, the confession spilling like something she had been holding back for years. Michael's gaze didn't waver. His words came quiet, steady, carrying more weight than her empire ever could. "She doesn't need an empire. She needs a mom." The silence after was sharp, a blade hanging in the air. For a fleeting second, something flickered in Rebecca's eyes, something raw and unguarded. Regret, maybe? Fear, certainly. The kind of fear that came when power couldn't shield you from the truth. But then, just as quickly, the mask slammed back down. Her jaw tightened, her spine straightened, and her tone sharpened into the familiar register of control. "Stay out of it!" she snapped, as if the command might reestablish the ground she felt slipping beneath her feet. Michael didn't move, didn't look away. He saw more than her words. He saw the tremor in her hand as she adjusted her blazer, the way her breathing faltered before she turned her face aside. He saw a woman unraveling in silence, hiding behind titles and wealth, while the one person who needed her most lay only feet away, turning her face to the wall whenever her mother drew near. Rebecca opened the door then, but her hesitation lingered like smoke. The strength she projected had become hollow, a shadow of itself. Inside the room, Ava stirred in her bed, her small frame dwarfed by hospital sheets. Rebecca hesitated again, her hand gripping the doorframe too tightly, knuckles pale. Michael stayed in the hall, his jaw set. He had his answer. Power couldn't fix loneliness. Money couldn't erase absence. And Rebecca, despite all her titles and assets, had already left. She might still be on the birth certificate, her name etched in ink the law couldn't deny, but in the ways that mattered, the quiet nights, the whispered reassurances, the promise to never walk away, she was already gone. The battles of adults played out in hushed tones behind closed doors, in clipped arguments over responsibility, rights, and signatures on paper. But inside Ava's hospital room, none of that mattered. The war for her future, for her place in the world, was fought with pencils and scraps of paper instead of gavel strikes or whispered accusations. Emily arrived one afternoon with a small bundle clutched to her chest, colored pencils worn down to stubs, and a stack of papers she had folded carefully into her backpack. Her eyes lit up when she saw Ava awake, propped weakly against her pillows, teddy bear still pressed close. Without a word, Emily hopped onto the bed and spread the papers across the blanket. "We need to build something," she declared with the quiet confidence of a child who knew how to take charge without sounding like it. She set a green pencil in Ava's hand, keeping the blue one for herself. At first, Ava hesitated. She had grown used to silence, to letting the world happen without asking her opinion. But Emily's energy was different, patient, not pushy, gentle, not pitying. She started by drawing a castle, its turrets leaning slightly, as if they too were tired. Ava watched, wide-eyed, and then slowly pressed the green pencil to the page. A tree emerged, uneven but earnest, branches stretching toward Emily's sky. For long minutes, neither spoke. The pencils whispered across paper, colors bleeding into shapes, stars scattered in corners, a crooked moon hanging low. When Emily leaned closer to shade the castle windows, Ava whispered so softly it might have been missed if the room hadn't been so still. "Do you think he meant it?" Her voice cracked, her eyes flicking toward the door where Michael had stood so many times. "When he said I was his?" Emily stopped coloring. She looked at Ava the way only a child can, direct, sincere, without any of the hesitation adults carry. Her smile was small, but certain. "My dad doesn't say things he doesn't mean." Something shifted in Ava's eyes then. The storm clouds that had lingered seemed to break just a little, revealing something softer underneath. Her shoulders, usually curled tight like she was trying to disappear into herself, loosened. She leaned against Emily, their heads touching lightly as they bent over the drawings. The papers rustled as their little worlds grew, castles surrounded by forests, stars connected by bridges, tiny stick-figure families standing beneath the sky they had built together. From the doorway, two nurses paused in their rounds. They whispered to each other, astonished at the sight. Ava was smiling, not faintly, not uncertainly, but smiling as though she had forgotten for a moment to be afraid. It was a sight so rare it felt like a miracle, and neither nurse dared interrupt it. Michael, standing in the hallway just beyond them, saw it too. He felt his chest ache in a way that wasn't pain exactly, but something close to it. Relief tangled with sorrow, pride tangled with awe. Emily was more than a daughter. She was becoming the bridge between a wounded girl and the world that had failed her. She wasn't just helping Ava heal. Ava was helping her too, teaching her patience, teaching her the power of being needed. Inside the room, crayons rolled across the blanket, laughter bubbled up like a sound the walls had never heard before, and for a moment the fight outside faded. No legal forms, no custody battles, just two little girls building something no paperwork could define. Healing, Michael thought, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's found in the scratch of colored pencils, in whispered questions answered with certainty, in the way two children can sit shoulder to shoulder, and decide without saying it out loud, we belong to each other now. The social worker returned in the middle of the afternoon, when the hallway lights glared their brightest and the hospital felt more like an office than a place of healing. Her shoes clicked against the linoleum with the weary rhythm of someone who had walked these corridors too many times. Her clipboard was clutched tightly to her chest, the same shield she carried everywhere, and her expression was practiced neutrality. She had seen it all before, children clinging to whoever happened to be nearest, adults swearing they would step up, promises made in the heat of crisis and broken once reality demanded too much. Her job wasn't to believe. Her job was to record, to recommend, to move the child along the pipeline the state had built for kids like Ava. But the moment she stepped into the room, something cracked through her routine. Ava was no longer lying limp and silent against her pillow. She was perched at the edge of the bed, her tiny fists gripping the fabric of Michael's shirt, like it was the only tether keeping her anchored. Her head was tucked against his side, her wide eyes darting nervously to the stranger in the doorway. Emily sat on the other side of the bed, one arm wrapped protectively around Ava's shoulders, like she had already decided the role of big sister belonged to her and no one else. The social worker hesitated, her pen frozen above the page. She cleared her throat, a sound too sharp in the delicate space of the room. "Mr. Hale," she began carefully, "I need you to understand the reality of this situation. You can't just—" her voice faltered when Ava's grip tightened. "You can't just claim her as your own." Michael rose slowly, gently disentangling himself without prying Ava's hand away. He moved toward the woman, his shoulders squared, but his eyes carried no malice, only a steady resolve that rooted him to the floor. "You have to understand," he said, his voice low but unshakable, "her mother isn't coming back." The words hovered in the air, and for a moment the only sound was the steady beep of Ava's heart monitor. The social worker shifted her weight, uncomfortable. She had heard parents abandon children in 1,000 different ways, but hearing it said so plainly from someone who wasn't even blood made her chest tighten. "And what if she does?" she asked finally. Her tone was meant to be professional, measured, but even she could hear the thinness in it. Michael didn't hesitate. His answer came quiet, but with steel threaded through it. "Then she'll have to fight me for her." Something in his delivery made the woman's throat close. It wasn't a boast, it wasn't a plea, it was truth, laid bare. She studied him, trying to fit what she was seeing into the neat boxes her job demanded: guardian, temporary caretaker, unfit claimant. But nothing matched. What stood before her wasn't desperation, it was devotion. She looked back at the girls on the bed. Emily's small hand was still on Ava's shoulder, steady, protective. Ava's wide eyes had softened, not because the social worker had spoken, but because Michael had. The child believed him, trusted him, clung to him like a lifeline. The scene was simple, undeniable. A janitor with calloused hands, a father worn thin by life but unbroken, and two little girls finding safety in each other's presence. The social worker's grip on her pen loosened. Her voice dropped to something quieter, less practiced. "I can't promise anything," she said, almost reluctantly, "but I'll document what I see." And as she scribbled notes onto her form, her chest ached in a way it hadn't in years. Because sometimes the truth didn't fit forms. Sometimes it didn't fit policies or regulations or tidy recommendations. Sometimes it only fit hearts. And hers, for the first time in longer than she could remember, carried the fragile ache of hope. News never stayed quiet where power was involved, and Rebecca Ward was power incarnate. The story began as a whisper, a nurse confiding in a friend, a staffer who couldn't stomach the silence. Within hours, the whisper became a leak, and by the next morning, it was splashed across headlines in bold black letters. Rebecca Ward's daughter left alone. The words stung like a wound pressed open, not just for Rebecca, but for the little girl curled in a hospital bed who hadn't asked for any of this. Cameras crowded the hospital entrance. News vans lined the curb. Microphones bristled at the automatic doors like spears waiting for a breach. Every journalist seemed hungry for a shot of Rebecca Ward arriving, a soundbite to feed the beast. They shouted questions that had nothing to do with pneumonia or childhood or healing. Is Ava a liability? Has she been abandoned for good? What does this mean for Ward Corp's future? They weren't looking for a mother. They were hunting for a headline. Inside, the hospital staff moved with tension carved into their bodies. Security tried to block the main lobby, but the cameras always found another angle, another lens pressed against glass. Rebecca's company scrambled for control. A PR statement was drafted and redrafted. Lawyers argued over phrasing, and board members demanded reassurances that the brand would survive the scandal. To them, Ava wasn't a child. She was an image problem. And then, just as quickly as the narrative had sharpened its claws, it shifted. It wasn't Rebecca Ward that captured attention. It was the janitor who had been seen walking through the corridors with two little girls, one sick and clinging, the other protective at his side. A staffer had snapped the photo, grainy but unmistakable. Michael Hale, head bowed, holding both Emily's and Ava's hands as they crossed a hallway together. The caption beneath it read simply, "Single Dad Steps In." The image spread faster than any carefully crafted statement ever could. Social media caught fire. People saw in him what boardrooms had missed, an ordinary man with nothing to gain, giving everything anyway. Tweets poured in. "You don't need to be rich to be a hero. This janitor shows what true fatherhood looks like." Hashtags bloomed overnight. Neon trails of solidarity. Hashtag She Is My Daughter. Hashtag Fathers Who Stay. Hashtag Real Family. Michael didn't notice at first. He was too busy fetching water for Ava, too busy straightening Emily's blanket when she fell asleep in a chair, too busy being present in ways that couldn't be captured in press releases. He didn't care about headlines, about viral moments, about people turning him into a symbol. He had one focus, two little girls who needed someone steady in a world that had failed them. But Ava noticed. She saw the nurse's phone lit with the photo. She saw the screen of a passing orderly scrolling through comments, strangers calling Michael a hero, calling her seen. That evening, when the noise outside grew louder, when the hospital buzzed with the chaos of attention, she tugged gently on Michael's sleeve. "They see us," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound, but full of something new. Michael looked down at her, puzzled, until she nodded toward the nurse's phone, toward the photo of him holding both girls' hands. For the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, no shame in being the child left behind. For the first time, she felt visible, not as the abandoned daughter of a CEO, but as part of something the world had chosen to celebrate. He swallowed hard, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "They see you," he said softly. Ava shook her head, the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly, almost a smile. "No, they see us." And in that moment, abandonment was no longer the story. Love was. The world could spin its narratives, headlines could come and go, But what remained was simple. 3 people clinging to one another like lifelines, finding family in the unlikeliest place, and discovering that sometimes the truest kind of power is the kind that never makes a profit, only a promise. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, a mix of tradition and fatigue. The walls were lined with shelves of law books no one had touched in years, their spines there only for show. Their weight meant to remind everyone that the law was older and larger than any of them. Michael sat at the table nearest the window, stiff in a suit that wasn't his, the shoulders a little too broad, the collar tugging awkwardly at his neck. A friend from church had pressed it into his hands the night before, insisting he couldn't walk into court in work clothes. He had thanked him, but the truth was, no matter how crisp the jacket looked, his hands gave him away. Calloused, rough, nicked from years of labor, they rested quietly on the table, a silent testimony of the life he lived. Across from him sat Rebecca, every inch composed. Her navy suit looked custom-tailored, her jewelry understated but expensive, her hair styled to suggest control. She didn't slouch, didn't fidget. Even the glass of water in front of her looked untouched, as though thirst itself was beneath her. Beside her, her lawyer leaned in with sharp whispers, each word honed like a blade, strategies polished to cut through sympathy and lean only on the law. The judge entered, and the room rose as one. He was older, silver hair thinning at the crown, lines carved deep around his eyes from years of listening to broken families insist they could be fixed by decree. His voice carried the weight of procedure. He called the case. He asked the questions. And then the battle began. Rebecca's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of stability measured in dollars, of futures paved with privilege. Rebecca could provide tutors, private schools, health care without wait lists, a home free from worry. The words fell smooth, calculated, a presentation of wealth as if it were synonymous with love. Rebecca added her own testimony, carefully rehearsed. She spoke of opportunity, of the life she could give her daughter if only she were returned. She didn't stumble, didn't falter. On paper it was unshakable. Then came Michael. He rose, smoothing the ill-fitting jacket, his throat dry but his gaze steady. He didn't have papers or charts or polished words. He only had the truth, and he spoke it plain. He talked about mornings when Emily's lungs clenched tight, and he sat at her bedside until the wheeze faded. He spoke of hand-packed lunches with notes folded inside, of bedtime stories told by flashlight when the power bill came late, of calloused hands that had braided hair badly but earnestly before school. He admitted he wasn't rich, wasn't polished, wasn't powerful, but he was present. "She doesn't need perfection," Michael said, his voice rough but sure. "She needs presence." The words settled into the courtroom like a weight no one had expected. The silence afterward wasn't empty, it was full. The judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting from Rebecca to Michael, and then finally to the children. Ava sat quietly, her small shoulders pressed against Emily's side. Emily's hand rested over hers, steady, protective, as though she knew the world was deciding something too big for either of them. And then the judge noticed the detail that mattered more than all the testimony, more than all the polished arguments and rehearsed lines. Ava's other hand was curled around Michael's, her tiny fingers tangled in his larger ones, holding tight like she'd found her anchor. Sometimes the truth doesn't live in arguments. Sometimes it isn't written in evidence or polished into statements. Sometimes it sits quietly, in who a child chooses to sit beside when the world asks her to decide where she belongs. The gavel didn't fall that day, not yet. Papers still needed to be filed, procedures followed, hearings scheduled, but the tide had shifted, and everyone in that room felt it. Rebecca's wealth might have bought her power, but Michael's presence had won something deeper. And though the case wasn't finished, though the law still demanded its steps, the heart of it had already been decided. Ava had chosen. The courtroom was colder that day, though whether it was the air conditioning or the tension, no one could say. Rebecca Ward sat at the witness stand, back rigid. Every inch of her the picture of a corporate titan accustomed to control. Her lawyer had prepared her, had spent hours drilling the lines she should recite, the image she needed to maintain. But a courtroom isn't a boardroom, and children aren't quarterly reports. The opposing attorney circled carefully, asking questions that sliced at the edges of her poise. At first, Rebecca parried with precision. She spoke of business obligations, of responsibilities too vast for ordinary people to comprehend, of the pressures that came with running a global company. Her voice was crisp, even, the same tone she used to calm investors when stocks dipped. But beneath it was a tremor, faint at first, then stronger, like a hairline crack spreading across glass. "And yet," the attorney pressed, "you left your daughter alone in a hospital bed." "Why?" Rebecca's lips parted, but no sound came at first. The silence stretched, heavy, unbearable. Finally she exhaled, her eyes dropping to the wood of the stand as though she could disappear into it. "I thought—" Her voice broke, the polish falling away. "I thought she'd be better off without me." The words echoed through the chamber, fragile, devastating. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Even the judge blinked, pen paused above his notepad. For a woman whose entire existence had been built on power, the confession was a fracture through her armor. Michael, seated only feet away, leaned forward slightly. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the stunned air like a blade of truth. "And was she?" Rebecca looked at him then, eyes flashing wide for a heartbeat, before darting away. Her throat worked, but no answer came. She tried to form words, but nothing left her mouth. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation, heavier than any verdict. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising like the rustle of dry leaves. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the moment when the untouchable CEO unraveled. She had come into the courtroom with her fortune, her reputation, her sharp-edged team of lawyers, and yet here, in the quiet after her own admission, she had nothing. Michael sat straighter, not triumphant, but steady. His borrowed suit still hung awkwardly on his frame, his tie slightly askew, but none of that mattered. He had no title, no wealth, no prestige. But what he held in that moment was something none of Rebecca's millions could buy. He held the unshakable presence of a father who stayed. The judge's gaze flicked from Rebecca, trembling at the stand, to Michael, steady at the table, to the little girl sitting quietly beside Emily, her hand tucked securely in his. The contrast was undeniable, and it filled the room with an unspoken verdict long before the legal one could come. Rebecca lowered her head, fingers trembling as they twisted together in her lap. Her empire couldn't shield her here. Her power couldn't rewrite this truth. The world didn't see a CEO anymore. They saw a mother who had run when it mattered most. And beside her, visible to everyone in that chamber, was the man who had stepped into the gap, who had nothing to offer except his presence. And yet, that was everything. The janitor who stayed. The courthouse steps were still buzzing when the social worker found him. Reporters huddled in clusters nearby, microphones angled toward anyone willing to speculate on what had just unraveled inside. Michael stood off to the side, his hand resting protectively on Emily's shoulder, while Ava clung to his other arm like the world might snatch her away if she loosened her grip. His suit jacket was rumpled, his tie crooked, but his eyes were clear. He had walked into that building a janitor with no power, and walked out carrying something money couldn't measure, credibility carved from love. The social worker's heels clicked against the concrete as she approached, clipboard tucked against her ribs, as though it were a shield she wasn't sure she needed anymore. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze shifting between the two girls anchored to his sides. Then she exhaled and spoke. "If you're serious," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, "we can begin adoption proceedings." Michael's chest tightened. The words landed heavy, heavier than any gavel, heavier than any judgment passed down inside. Adoption. This wasn't a promise whispered in the dark or a comfort given in a hospital bed. This was forever. His mind jolted immediately to the numbers he had scrawled on notepads late at night. Rent teetering on late notices, grocery lists pared down to bare essentials, asthma inhalers lined up in the cupboard like sentinels he could barely afford to keep. He thought of the hours he worked cleaning floors no one noticed, the aching in his knees, the overtime shifts that still never seemed to stretch enough. How could he possibly shoulder more? But before doubt could harden into hesitation, Ava moved. She pressed her small frame into his chest, arms wrapping tight around his middle. Her voice trembled against his shirt, muffled but clear enough to cut through every layer of fear. "Please don't let them take me." That was it. Every argument crumbled. Every worry about bills and numbers and what he lacked fell silent. The choice had already been made long before the paperwork, long before the hearings. It had been made the first time he knelt beside her bed and told her she wasn't alone. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and when he lifted his head, his voice carried the quiet weight of conviction. "Start the papers." The social worker blinked, her professional mask faltering just slightly as she scribbled on her clipboard. His words had no hesitation, no loopholes, no conditions. They weren't about survival anymore. They were about belonging. Emily slipped into the circle of their embrace, her thin arms wrapping around both of them. She leaned close to Ava, her lips brushing her ear as she whispered, "Told you he meant it." Ava let out a small, broken sound that was half sob, half laugh, the kind of sound that comes when hope finally outweighs fear. She buried her face deeper into Michael's chest, her small shoulders trembling as if she couldn't believe safety had actually chosen her. Michael held both girls tighter, his eyes lifting to the sky above the courthouse, pale and cloud-streaked. For the first time in years, his chest didn't feel hollow. It felt full, achingly, frighteningly, beautifully full. A family of three, not stitched by blood, but by choice. And standing there, with Ava's plea still echoing in his ears and Emily's certainty woven into the air, Michael realized choice was stronger than circumstance, stronger than fear, stronger than every wall the world had tried to put between them. This wasn't temporary. This was forever. Ava's nights were the hardest. Daylight gave her distractions, coloring with Emily, quiet games in the corner, the hum of television reruns. But night peeled everything back. When the hospital machines had gone silent and the halls had emptied of footsteps, when the house was dark and the walls carried nothing but her breathing, that's when the fear returned. It came like a wave, crashing over her small body until she jolted awake, heart pounding, her throat raw from screams she didn't know she'd made. Michael was always there. No matter how deep the exhaustion pulled at him after double shifts, no matter how his body begged for rest, he came running the moment her cries split the silence. He'd sit on the edge of her bed, his broad frame hunched so he could meet her eyes, his voice low and steady as stone. "I'm here," he'd whisper over and over, as if repetition itself could anchor her. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Sometimes he'd stay like that until dawn, his hand resting lightly over hers, a quiet sentinel against the terrors that came when the world closed its eyes. Emily was just as constant. She would wake at the sound of Ava's cries and slip silently into the room, hair tangled from sleep, eyes bleary, but determined. Without waiting for permission, she'd climb into the bed beside her, pressing her small hand into Ava's palm. "It's okay," she'd murmur, half asleep but still sure. "You're safe." And Ava, trembling, would finally settle, caught between Michael's whispered promises and Emily's solid presence. It wasn't immediate. Healing never is. For weeks, the nightmares returned with the same sharp edges, dragging Ava back into the memory of abandonment. The image of her mother walking out the door replayed in her mind like a cruel lullaby. Each time, Michael and Emily answered the same way, with patience, with presence, with a love that didn't retreat. Slowly, the sharpness dulled. The cries grew shorter. The shaking eased. The nightmares didn't vanish all at once, but each time she woke, she found proof waiting for her, that this time no one was leaving. One morning, after a night without tears, Michael found her at the kitchen table, a crayon clutched in her hand. She was drawing a house, its walls crooked but colorful, windows glowing yellow. Inside were 3 figures, small stick shapes with smiles too wide for their heads. She slid the paper across to him shyly, her eyes searching his face for approval. He studied it, his throat tightening, then pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a star. "Looks perfect," he said softly. It became a pattern. Each week new drawings appeared, more houses, always with 3 figures inside. Sometimes she added flowers along the walkway, sometimes a dog she wished for, sometimes a sun that stretched over the roof like a warm hand. Michael hung every one. Soon the refrigerator door was no longer just an appliance. It was a gallery, a record of healing told in crayons and construction paper, proof that Ava's fear was giving way to belonging. The laughter came next, small at first, unsure, like she had to test whether it was allowed. Emily coaxed it out of her with silly faces, with whispered jokes only sisters could invent. Then it grew louder, filling the house with a sound Michael hadn't realized he'd been starving for. Every giggle was a victory. Every smile was a milestone. Sometimes in the quiet hours when the house finally slept, Michael would stand in front of that fridge, staring at the drawings. He'd think about how healing doesn't always bloom under sunlight. Sometimes it's forged in the darkness, in the raw places where fear is met not with explanations, but with presence. Sometimes it's built in midnight whispers, in promises repeated until a child finally believes them. And as he looked at those crayon houses, always with 3 figures inside, Michael understood something deeper than words. They weren't just drawings. They were declarations. Proof that family isn't always inherited. Sometimes it's chosen, sometimes it's fought for, and sometimes it's simply promised, again and again, until the promise becomes truth. Rebecca's company moved quickly, as companies always do when the air begins to smell like scandal. Press releases were drafted overnight, carefully worded statements rolled out to reporters. Words like misunderstood and taken out of context appeared in headlines, paired with glossy photos of Rebecca at charity galas, smiling beneath chandeliers. Her team painted her absence not as abandonment, but as a difficult season in which she had been unfairly judged by those who didn't understand the pressures of leadership. To the public, it was damage control. To those who had seen Ava's face when she whispered, "She's not coming back," is she? It was just noise. Michael ignored all of it. He refused interviews, brushed past microphones thrust in his face outside the courthouse, waved away reporters who lingered outside the hospital. He had no appetite for spectacle, no interest in becoming anyone's symbol. His life was too full already. 2 little girls who needed him, bills that never seemed to stop coming, nights that stretched long and heavy with both exhaustion and gratitude. He thought if he kept his head down, the noise would pass him by. But the noise found him anyway. One evening he stood in a community center gym, folding chairs set in uneven rows, the air thick with the smell of coffee and floor polish. It was a meeting for local parents, nothing glamorous, just tired people trading stories about raising kids on shoestring budgets, about schools that needed funding, about the way hope sometimes felt too expensive to afford. Michael had come quietly, hoping to listen, but someone recognized him. Then another, until all eyes turned his way. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but when a man asked what had really happened, Michael stood. His hands stayed shoved in his pockets, his head slightly bowed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not a hero," he said simply. "I'm just a dad who couldn't watch another child be left behind." The words came out rough, unpolished, but they landed with the weight of truth. He didn't talk about Rebecca, didn't talk about courts or headlines. He spoke about Ava's tears in the night, about Emily's quiet strength, about how sometimes love doesn't wait until you have enough money or the right circumstances. Sometimes It just demands you show up. Someone at the back had their phone out, then someone else. By the end of the evening, half the room had recorded him. He didn't notice. He was too focused on finishing, on sitting back down, on slipping into silence again. But the internet noticed. The video spread faster than any press release could contain. It wasn't packaged, wasn't edited. It was raw, shaky, filmed from folding chairs with bad lighting. And maybe that was why it worked. People across the country shared it, fathers admitting they had failed and wanted to do better, mothers writing messages of hope about the nights they, too, had sat in hospital rooms praying someone would simply stay. The hashtags returned, not as noise this time, but as a chorus. Hashtag fathers who stay, hashtag love is enough, hashtag she is my daughter. In the small living room of their apartment, Ava and Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, the glow of the television flickering across their faces. Ava clutched her teddy bear, eyes wide as she watched the blurry video of Michael appear on the evening news. His voice was soft, tired, but steady, filling the room like it had filled the community center. When the clip ended, Ava turned to Emily, her voice barely more than a whisper, but carrying pride that made her chest swell. "That's my dad." The world had doubted him, written him off as nothing more than a janitor, a man with rough hands and empty pockets. But Ava never would. For her, he wasn't a headline or a symbol. He was the promise kept when the world walked away, and that, to her, was everything. The hallway looked the same, though time had passed. The same white tiles stretched endlessly, the same overhead lights buzzed with a faint electric hum, and the same antiseptic smell clung to the air. But for Michael, walking there now with Ava's hand in one of his and Emily's in the other, the place felt different. It wasn't fear pressing against his ribs this time. It wasn't grief or exhaustion. It was something quieter, steadier, the kind of peace that comes only after surviving storms you thought might break you. When they reached the door, Ava hesitated. Her small fingers tightened around his, not from fear, but from the weight of remembering. Emily glanced up at her sister, then gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Together, the three of them stepped inside. The room was empty now. No 4 lines humming, no heart monitor flickering in the corner, no small figure trembling beneath a blanket too big for her frame. Just a bed made neatly with crisp white sheets and the faint scent of disinfectant. And yet, even in its stillness, the room carried echoes. Michael could feel them. He could almost hear Ava's hollow question again. "She's not coming back, is she?" The one that had carved itself into him and changed everything. Ava let go of his hand and walked slowly toward the bed. She traced her fingers along the rail, her expression unreadable. For a moment she seemed like the small, frightened girl she had been, the one who had clung to a battered teddy bear and tried to disappear into the folds of a pillow. But then she turned to him, her eyes brighter, older somehow. "This was where you saved me," she whispered. Michael swallowed, the words pressing against his chest with a tenderness that ached. He shook his head, voice rough but steady. "No, kiddo. This is where you saved me." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. Then Ava's lips curved into a smile, not the tentative kind he'd grown used to, not the small flicker that carried sadness at its edges. This smile was different. It was whole. It was free. For the first time since he had known her, she smiled, without sorrow shadowing it. Emily leaned against the window ledge, sunlight catching in her hair. "Feels weird, huh?" she said softly. "Like it should still look the same, but it doesn't." Michael looked around the room, at the sterile bed, the blank walls, the air that smelled more of memory than medicine now. He nodded. "That's because it's not the room that changed. It's us." Ava climbed carefully onto the bed, her small legs swinging over the edge. She sat upright, shoulders back, as though reclaiming it. Emily joined her without hesitation, curling beside her. Michael stood for a moment, taking them in. The two girls, who had been strangers to each other once, now stitched together so tightly It was hard to imagine them apart. He crossed the room and sat at the foot of the bed, his presence filling the quiet without needing words. Healing had come full circle. The janitor who once mopped these very floors, invisible to the world, stood now as something larger than he had ever dreamed, not because of money, not because of power, but because of love that had refused to let go, love that had turned abandonment into belonging, love that had turned 3 broken pieces into a whole. Michael looked at the girls, their heads bent together in some whispered secret, their laughter spilling softly into the room that once held nothing but tears. His chest tightened with gratitude. Family, he realized, wasn't measured by names on a certificate or titles on a business card. It wasn't about wealth or prestige or reputation. Family was built here, in rooms like this, in promises kept when the world had given up. This was his empire, not a boardroom, not a skyscraper, but 2 little girls who called him Dad. And it was enough. It was everything. It came on an ordinary afternoon, tucked inside a plain white envelope that looked almost out of place among the stack of bills and advertisements. No company letterhead, no embossed logos, just a shaky, handwritten address scrawled across the front. Michael noticed it as he sifted through the mail, his thumb pausing over the unfamiliar script. He knew instantly who it was from. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he carried it into the apartment, the paper light in his hand, but heavy in meaning. Emily was on the floor, sprawled across a sea of crayons and half-finished drawings. Ava sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open, her pencil moving slowly across the page as if she were sketching memories rather than shapes. Michael placed the envelope in front of her. "It's for you," he said softly. Ava looked at it, her fingers hovering over the edge, before she finally slid it closer. She tore the flap carefully, almost reverently, and unfolded the pages inside. The handwriting was elegant but unsteady, the kind of script born from someone who had spent a lifetime signing contracts, but very little time writing to the people who mattered. "My dearest Ava," it began. Michael watched her eyes move across the lines, her lips pressed together. The words unfolded quietly, a confession of absence, a catalogue of regrets. Rebecca wrote of boardrooms and deadlines, of building an empire while watching her child slip through her fingers. She admitted she had failed, not because Ava wasn't enough, but because she herself had never learned how to be a mother. "I thought you'd be better off without me," the letter read. "I see now how wrong I was. You deserved more than my fear. You deserved more than my excuses. And though I cannot undo the past, I can at least step aside and let you have the love I could not give." There was no plea for custody, no demand to be part of Ava's future. Just one final line that trembled where the pen had pressed too hard. "Thank you for giving her what I could not." The room was silent when Ava reached the end. She held the letter a moment longer, then placed it gently on the table and turned to Michael. Her eyes were steady, though her voice was almost a whisper. "Can we keep it?" Michael swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "Of course," he said. Her small hands folded the letter with care, edges pressed precisely, corners aligned as though the paper itself were fragile. She slipped it into the pocket of her sketchbook and smoothed it flat. "Not as proof she left," she added softly. "As proof I made it through." Michael nodded, his chest aching in a way that felt both painful and profound. It wasn't proof of abandonment anymore. It was proof of survival, of resilience, of a girl who had been broken but not defeated. That evening, Ava drew again, her pencil moving quickly across the page. When she was done, she showed it to Emily and Michael. A picture of a small house, 3 figures inside, 2 taller, 1 smaller, and beside it, a folded letter drawn in careful detail. Above it, she had written in her uneven scrawl, "Chosen." Michael felt the words settle inside him like a vow. Ava's story wasn't one of being unwanted anymore. It was one of being chosen, twice. once by a mother who, in her absence, admitted the truth, and once again by a father who had looked at her and seen not a burden, not a liability, but a daughter. He reached out and pulled both girls close, their laughter mixing with the rustle of crayon pages and the hum of life continuing. The letter lay tucked safely away, no longer a wound, but a marker of how far they'd come. And in the quiet that followed, Michael understood. Survival had given them family, but love had made them whole. The evening was gentle, the kind that crept in slow and unhurried, carrying the smell of cut grass and blooming lilacs. The backyard was nothing grand, patchy lawn, a chain-link fence that leaned slightly, a grill Michael had picked up secondhand years ago, but to him it felt like a kingdom. Smoke curled lazily from the grill as hot dogs sizzled, the faint hiss blending with the laughter of two little girls darting barefoot across the grass. Emily and Ava chased fireflies, their giggles lifting into the warm spring air like music. That morning the envelope had arrived, thick, official, stamped in bold letters that carried more weight than he could describe. Inside, pages marked by signatures and seals told the story the world had finally caught up to. Ava was no longer a ward of the state, no longer a case number or a child in limbo. She was his. She was a Hale, irrevocable, permanent, forever. Michael had read the words 3 times before believing them. Then Ava had taken the papers in her small hands, running her fingers across the raised seal as though she could feel the truth carved into it. She hadn't said much, just hugged him so tightly he felt her heartbeat against his chest. Emily had whooped loud enough for the neighbors to hear, declaring it the best day in history. And now, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, he grilled their celebratory dinner like it was a feast fit for royalty. The fireflies blinked lazily in the dusk, and Ava squealed with delight each time she cupped one between her hands, only to open her palms and watch it drift back into the air. Emily showed her how to catch them gently, how not to squeeze too hard. Their silhouettes danced against the fading light, 2 figures moving in sync, sisters in every way that mattered. Michael flipped the hot dogs, the sizzle reminding him of every simple meal he'd cobbled together to stretch through lean weeks. Tonight it didn't feel like scraping by. Tonight it felt like abundance, not because of what they were eating, but because of who was there to share it. When the food was ready, he called them over. They came running, cheeks flushed, hair messy, eyes shining with the glow of captured joy. They settled on the back steps, plates balanced on their knees, ketchup smudges already appearing before the first bite. Michael cracked open a soda, the fizz loud in the quiet evening, and raised the can toward the sky. "To my daughters," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Emily and Ava grinned, raising their juice boxes high. "To Dad," they chimed in unison, the words ringing brighter than any applause he'd ever heard. Their boxes clinked against his can, and the simple sound felt like the closing note of a long, unfinished song finally finding its resolution. Above them, the first stars began to blink awake, timid at first, then bolder as the sky darkened. Michael leaned back, his shoulders easing into the cool air, and let himself breathe in the moment. He thought of the nights spent in hospital chairs, of whispered promises in the dark, of courtrooms heavy with judgment. He thought of how close it had all come to slipping away, how fragile it had seemed. And now, here they were, bound not by blood alone, but by choice, by resilience, by love that refused to let go. This wasn't just an ending, he realized. It wasn't even a victory, though it felt like one. It was a beginning. The beginning of a life not defined by fear or absence, but by laughter in a backyard, by juice boxes raised in unison, by a girl who once asked if anyone would ever stay, and now knew the answer. As the fireflies rose higher and the stars stitched themselves across the night sky, Michael wrapped an arm around each of his daughters and pulled them close. He had thought survival was all he could offer, but tonight, as their heads rested against his shoulders, he knew better. This was home, at last, forever. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a reminder that family is built on love, not circumstance. And don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of hope, courage, and second chances are on the way.